Dear colleagues, it's great to see you all, and I'm very pleased to present this lecture to Belief Narrative Network. And the title, as you see at the slide, is A Religion of War: How Messianic Sentiments, Military Rituals, and Conspiracy Theories Made Putinism Effective. The Russian invasion of Ukraine brought catastrophic consequences to all of Europe and might even lead to a global war. A large number of Russians have relatives and friends living in Ukraine. Yet it is still obvious that many Russian citizens uncritically believe the official propaganda put forth by Putin's regime and support the war. In this lecture, I will try to make sense of the paradox and explain what kind of political cosmology and ritual practice made Putinism as a political doctrine so successful with ordinary Russians. I must admit, however, that I do not consider myself to be a political scientist or sociologist in any sense. I am an anthropologist and folklorist studying vernacular religious cultures, contemporary legends, and conspiracy theories in Russian and post-Soviet contexts. When the topic of this lecture was discussed in the beginning of the year, I intended to present on how combination of mimetic approaches to culture, the actor network theory, and the cognitive science of religion could contribute to present-day folklore research. The war, however, urged me to switch to more prescient issues and to change the topic of my lecture. Actually, I never attempted to do any thorough sociological research on political views of present-day Russians. However, I hope that my anthropological understanding of ideological and cultural contexts of Putin's war on Ukraine might be helpful to see some grassroots trends that made the war possible. In his recent New York Times essay, the American historian Timothy Snyder states that today's Russia meets most of the criteria that scholars tend to apply while discussing fascism. It has, he argues, a cult around a single leader, Vladimir Putin. It has a cult of the dead organized around World War II. It has a myth of a past golden age of imperial greatness to be restored by a war of hidden violence, the murderous war on Ukraine. A time traveler from the 1930s would have no difficulty identifying the Putin's regime as fascist. The symbol Z, the rallies, the propaganda, the war as a cleansing act of violence, and the death pits around Ukrainian towns make it all very plain. In my opinion, however, this comparison yet seems to be a bit superficial and does not pay enough attention to how both propaganda and vernacular political cosmologies work in practice. Is there a cult around a single leader in present-day Russia indeed? Why the cult of the dead appears to be so popular and successful here? How do ordinary people imagine what Snyder calls healing violence? In the following, I will try to discuss these particular aspects of collective social imagination in present-day Russia in terms of religion and ritual. Students of contemporary culture still discuss how significant could be the gap between historical and so-called hyper-real or invented religions, serious and playful emotions felt by their followers, and the very understanding of reality informing respective ontologies. According to Adam Possemeyer, hyper-real religion refers to a simulacrum of a religion created out of or in symbiosis with popular culture, which provides inspiration for believers or consumers. In this world, there is no fixed metacode. postmodern or late modern society is saturated by images with the media generating a non-material, dematerialized concept of reality. It seems we live in an economy of science in which signs are exchanged against each other rather than against the real. In my opinion, this perspective could be as well discussed in relation not only to hyperreal or invented religions in the strict sense of the term, but also to various forms of political rituals, social cosmologies, and historical ideologies in present-day society. Here we need to trace down how particular forms and motives of popular culture produce the very sense of reality as well as collective emotions and types of social actions. And today I will focus on three related trends of popular culture in Putin's Russia, which are somehow related to the ideologies of the present-day war, namely Messianic ideas and sentiments, military rituals, and conspiracy theories. In the late 1980s and early 90s, the republics of the former USSR witnessed an explosive growth of in Messianic religious movements that predicted future apocalypse and promised to save their followers or even the whole world from expected disasters. Although related to particular social and religious ideas and practices evoked by the collapse of the Soviet Union, these messianic and apocalyptic expectations reflected deeper patterns of Russian social imagination that could be traced to at least the last decades of the 19th century, when the concept of Moscow, the Third Rome, was extracted from a little-known text by a 16th century monk from Pskov. Both the communist utopia and the victory in World War II were represented officially and perceived by many by many Soviet people as saving mankind from capitalism and fascism. These messianic patterns could be discussed as, for example, a byproduct of suspended modernization or a kind of imperialist ideology or just an effective propagandistic device for social mobilization under authoritarian rule. I would not say, however, that this worldview is somehow related to alleged Russian religious mentality. I would rather it was a local adaptation of European political thought. But at any rate, it constitutes an important, although not always explicit, component of what I would call Rus-Soviet identity, a contradictory hybrid of imperial, nationalist, and religious ideas and sentiments that became immensely popular in Russia under Putin. Besides the idea of saving the world, it inherited a quasi-religious notion of everlasting struggle between good and evil and images of secular martyrdom and self-sacrifice. The collapse of the Soviet Union and disillusionment with the communist idea made these patterns problematic. It was not really clear where good and evil resided, why and how the world could be saved, and why personal or collective self-sacrifice should be performed. The religious revival of or the so-called religious revival of the 1990s didn't seem to be really successful or consistent in Russia. Although Putin's regime did try to employ the Russian Orthodoxy and other so-called traditional religions to construct new post-Soviet identities, that did not prove to be effective, especially in terms of collective mobilization. However, there existed another influential, dualistic, messianic, and sacrificial narrative, the World War II post-memories. Official Soviet memorialization of the Great Patriotic War became especially intense under Brezhnev, with huge monuments, military parades, elaborate ceremonies, and commemoration of martyrs. One of the central motives of the official heroic narrative can be called genealogical, since war victims and heroes were praised as those who provided the very possibility of life for the Soviet people. There existed, however, another and yet more influential genealogical narrative of the October Revolution and collective path to communism. In the hierarchy of late Soviet holidays, so to say, November 7 stood higher than Victory Day. At the same time, World War II mythologies and related rituals presented a kind of alternative to the official communist ideologies for the late Soviet society. The more skeptical were ordinary citizens about the communist future, the more susceptible they were to the militarized memorial culture, which seemed to provide what could be called senses of ritual agency, efficacy, and authenticity. Here I draw on the studies of ritual agency by present-day cognitive scientists of religion, and more precisely, the ideas formulated by the Danish scholar Jesper Sørensen. He suggests that ritual behavior in itself makes representations of superhuman agents highly relevant, as these solve two problems potentially arising in people's comprehension of ritual performance. First, who specifies the actions performed, that is, why those actions. And second, how are the actions related to their purported result, that is, why is efficacy ascribed to the actions. In this context, theories that argue that beliefs in superhuman agents motivate the performance of religious rituals might be on the wrong track. An alternative explanation focuses on the role of ritualized behavior in producing cues that makes the evocation of existing culturally transmitted superhuman agents highly relevant, or alternatively lead to the production of new superhuman agents. In the 1990s, the communist master narrative vanished almost completely, and war commemoration began to wane. However, it was revitalized under Putin and gradually took the form of civil or political religion with sacred objects and landscapes, cult of heroes and martyrs, and the dead still present among the living. In 2012, television journalist from Tomsk initiated a new commemorative ritual known as the Immortal Regiment. More than 6,000 people in the Siberian city paraded on May 9 with portraits of their dead relatives who had taken part in World War II. The ritual gained rapid popularity in Russia. In 2015, the memorial procession in Moscow was led by Putin himself and gathered together hundreds of thousands of participants. 1 year later, an economist from the Russian Academy of Sciences even suggested that the war dead should receive voting rights in Russia so that their descendants would have additional votes in elections. Thus, war memories were transformed into a cosmogonic and Messianic narrative that appeared to be immensely successful in a country where nearly every family commemorated relatives or ancestors who had perished in the war. Obviously, the sense of superhuman agents being involved in ritual activities can differ in various ritual cultures, including religious and secular ones, and related cosmologies. One can ask whether war heroes and victims addressed by the living in commemorative rituals are believed to be as real as, for example, saints and spirits of nature in more traditional, more archaic ritual practices. Both the similarity and the difference could be analyzed here in particular in relation to how images and discourses of blasphemy and desecration are employed by a given ritual culture. In pre-modern Christian cultures, blasphemy and sacrilege seem to be generally understood as transgressions of ritual norms and rules established by non-human agents. This obviously might be dangerous to a blasphemer, his or her kin or community in terms of divine punishment and loss of ritual efficacy. However, narratives of blasphemy and medieval and agrarian vernacular Christianity rather tell us about re-establishment of rules and norms that make rituals even more efficient and communication between humans and non-human beings more predictable. That means that the idea of blasphemy in these contexts is related to a kind of animistic moral economy of ongoing negotiations between living and dead humans, spirits, holy figures, sacred objects, and so on. Modern secular states create their own symbols, rituals, and ideas of agency, identity, and belonging. Yet secular culture still cannot avoid dealing with super or non-human agents, albeit related to new sensibilities and semiotic ideologies. Political leaders, especially in totalitarian and authoritarian states, secular mottos, political allegories and collective images like motherland or unknown soldier might be also viewed as ritual agents that could be offended by blasphemers. Here, however, blasphemy and profanity are probably believed to be endangering social order and sense of belonging, and they could lead to a moral panic rather than to re-establishment of ritual rules. This seems quite obvious in the case of recent Russian politics of memory related to World War II. The agents that either implicitly or explicitly were believed to be offended in the case of desecration of war memorials or historical truth were either dead ancestors, that is, heroes or victims of the war, or still living veterans, or the state itself, or the Russian Soviet or Soviet people in general. Although a bit vague, these personages of collective imagination or ontology were probably believed to guarantee or secure existing social order, which in turn is genealogically related to the victory in the war. This order was understood and represented in terms of belonging and kinship rather than prosperity and well-being of a given religious community or congregation. It seems that ritual discourses of this kind contributed in a number of ways to militarization of the Russian society in the past 2 decades. Military rituals that revitalized World War II post-memories were not limited to state holidays, parades, and official ceremonies. Ritualized reanimation of the war in Putin's Russia involved hugely popular practices of historical reconstruction, youth paramilitary clubs, novels and movies about time travel and or alternative history of the war, neo-Stalinist literature, and so on. All these forms of popular culture could be interpreted as hyper-religious, that is, producing the sense of presence and authenticity. The war itself, in this context, could be imagined as both cosmogonic and apocalyptic event, both the golden age and the last judgment that makes the Messianic narrative effective and brings back the sense of belonging. However, the narrative itself did not deal with the problem of theodicy, that is, with how and why evil continued to exist in this world already saved by Russia, by Russians or the Soviet people. The answer was provided with post-Soviet conspiracy theories that usually concentrated on national freedom and morality threatened by evil outsiders. The so-called Dulles Plan, a conspiratorial forgery widely publicized in Russian since 1992, taught, for example, about the secret post-war politics of the United States toward the Soviet Union, allegedly aimed at disseminating false values, vulgarization of national morality, promotion of the basest feelings, drunkenness and drug addiction, nationalism and ethnic hatred. An overview of both indigenous and global conspiracy theories that became especially popular in post-Soviet Russia demonstrates a particular obsession with both moral and physical purity and danger, where the image of corrupted morality and corrupted or endangered traditional that actually could mean authentic values was closely connected to fears of bodily degradation, polluted food, environment, and so on. Symptomatically enough, present-day Putinist war propaganda employs both the image of moral dangers brought to Ukraine from the West, including, for example, same-sex marriages, and on the other hand, the myth of American biolabs intended either to disseminate particular dangerous diseases or even to elaborate a certain weapon allegedly targeted at Slavic or Russian DNA. Generally speaking, however, this conspiratorial imagination of polluted moralities and bodies could be still discussed as a form of the global trend that was called agency panic by the American scholar Timothy Melley. That is an intense fear that individuals can be shaped or controlled by powerful external forces. At any rate, it is obvious that post-Soviet conspiracy culture made the Putinist grand narrative consistent with the war, with imaginary fascism, and was reanimated by militarized rituals or even hyper-religion. Conspiracy theories explained that the nation's freedom, morality, and traditional values were at stake at this war. In the 2010s, the narrative gradually became the basis of Rus-Soviet identity for millions. Messianic, Manichaean, apocalyptic, and conspiratorial narratives provide a language for collective political imagination, and it is often unclear whether people take them seriously and if they could influence or shape social action, including violence and war. Unfortunately, in present-day Russia, the Putinist narrative appears to have become so attractive that it has made too many Russians support the invasion of Ukraine. It is worth asking how this collective delusion works on a personal level. The Putinist narrative, as far as I see it, operates as a virus of mind that effectively creates what was called emotional communities by the American historian Barbara Rosenbaum. Exploiting the modes of emotional expression that people expect, encourage, tolerate, and deplore, it provides effective bonds and a sense of belonging, particularly valued in the weak, atomized, and unequal Russian society of the present day. I deliberately do not try in this presentation to distinguish between manipulative propaganda and popular sentiments of ordinary Russians. In a way, they could be viewed as parts or aspects of an overall hyper-religious cosmology and ritual culture that made the war on Ukraine possible. Thank you, and I will be glad to hear your comments and questions.